The Newsagents.
Before we start today's episode, we just wanted to offer our thoughts and prayers, which today must go to the MP for South West Norfolk, the Right Honourable Mary Elizabeth Truss.
I'm afraid we have not taken on the left enough. And the left don't just compete with us at the ballot box now. They also work to take over our institutions. And we've seen that. We see it in much of the media. We see it in corporations. We see it most of all in the quangos and government bureaucracy that emerged under Tony Blair.
What you heard there was a speech made by Liz Truss at something called PopCon, Popular Conservatism. It is yet another movement from the Conservative Party designed to try and come up with new ideas to make conservatism popular again. You might at this point be wondering, is Liz Truss the right person to carry that torch? We went along to PopCon, so you don't have to. Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And we will be visiting the Commonwealth a little later in the programme to talk to one John Sopel.
But first we have, of course, got to talk about PopCon, which is the latest faction, the latest iteration of conservatism to try and affect the conservative conversation. And if you're feeling a bit confused or a bit dazed, because you might remember our episode about NatCon, National Conservatives, well, funnily enough, yeah, we are a bit too, because just like PopCon, I went along to NatCon, which was basically being launched in almost the same building, in the same street, with many of the same sorts of people. If you're sat there thinking, is this People's Front of Judea or Judean People's Front, perhaps you could be forgiven. But yes, this is the latest attempt, this time spearheaded by Liz Truss and her stalwart ally Mark Littlewood, formerly of the free market think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs. They say to try and start a new conversation about how conservatism can be invigorated for the modern age.
Yeah, and we're just going to ask you to look past the irony of a former Prime Minister who utterly bombed in the polls and indeed was kicked out of her job, leading what she likes to call the populist revolution, PopCon. She is coming up with ideas that she believes still have a lot of support in the country, and she's presenting it as this sort of ideological fight from the grassroots, as if her party, and indeed as if she herself, hadn't actually been in power already, weren't still in power, because she's talking about the battle for the Conservatives in the country. And she's talking about anti-green rhetoric, anti-net zero, anti-woke, anti-elite, obviously anti-immigration. Now, some of those areas will chime with large sections of the Conservative Party, and some of it will actually leave many of her colleagues, former colleagues, aghast that she thinks she is the person to be leading this conversation, having already failed so dismally in the top job. I mean, we're going to be speaking to the MP Charles Walker a little bit later about his thoughts on why she's doing it, what role it is playing more widely.
Yeah, look, this is a very unusual event. It's unusual partly, Emily, as you've already alluded to, because you've got, I was stood at the front, and obviously on the front row there is this collection of Conservative figures who, can we put it this way, are pretty controversial in different ways. You've got Liz Truss, you've got Jacob Rees-Mogg, you've got Lee Anderson. Difficult to prosecute the idea that these could be the torchbearers of a sort of renewed popular conservatism. These are people who, some people really like them, some people really very, very strongly dislike them. And then if you looked around the sort of rest of the room, it was like being in a room haunted and full of the ghosts of Conservative Party past, particularly on the right of the Conservative Party, who've been going to these sorts of events since time immemorial. I mean, I saw Toby Young, Lord Michael Ashcroft, Priti Patel, Nigel Farage, Tim Stanley, the Daily Telegraph columnist, Mark Littlewood, David Starkey was there. You know, these are the sort of people who, as I say, have been attending these sort of things for a long time. So on that level alone, talking about a kind of renewal of conservatism is a bit weird. That said, it does represent, and they did articulate, a school of thought which has increasingly started to dominate certainly the thinking of the right of the Conservative Party, which has been this idea that they are looking for a diagnosis as to why in their heads, despite the fact we've had 14 years of Conservative-led government, it can be that in their view, the country has become, in many ways, less conservative, not more. And they've got hung up on this idea, which is kind of, in a way, an extension of the Brexit argument, that Britain, and particularly conservative thought within Britain, is being held back by a whole array of institutions, both foreign and domestic. And they can be as wide-ranging as the courts, schools, academics, institutions, universities. I heard the World Health Organization was mentioned, the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights. On it goes, the Supreme Court. And in their view, all of these institutions are dominated by either people who are on the left, and that usually just means things that they disagree with, or by quote-unquote leftist thinking or woke thinking. And it is that, in their view, coupled with a belief that we're basically still stuck with the kind of legal architecture that Tony Blair set up. They're obsessed with Blair. They keep talking about all of the changes he brought in the Supreme Court and so on. They believe that all of these things have meant that they haven't been as conservative as they should have been, partly because Conservative leaders have made too many compromises with these forces over the years. And that is their kind of diagnosis as to why conservatism has been held back for as long as it has.
Yeah, and extraordinary, really, to be making these kind of speeches and having these kind of explorations in power while your party is still in power, when there is so much, I think we can all agree, still to do in the country. It's not like they've lost an election. It's not like they're wondering what went wrong. It's not like we're 6 months later and they're saying, oh, I wonder if we should, veer to the right or veer over here. They could actually be working towards solving, in a practical way, some of this country's problems. And yet we've got this kind of random diagnosis from people who have, I repeat, already been at the top of power.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, in so many ways, for me, this is really an attempt to create excuses, in some cases, for themselves personally. Right. So in Truss's case, she is still looking for a reason, and I can understand it must have been almost like a fever dream. You're Prime Minister, 49 days later, you're not Prime Minister. We know that one of the reasons that she has ascribed to that is not so much self-reflection and culpability to herself. She's talked about basically a kind of deep state attempt to try and remove
markets,
her. Woke, including the International Monetary Fund, the Bank of England, the markets, and so on. And so this is all part of that. And it reminds me, the tone of it really reminded me of two things. One is, in so many ways, it is like a kind of right-wing Benism. It is like the sort of thing, to hear the language that they use is so redolent of the sort of language that Tony Benn would use, talking about the fact that Labour governments had not wanted to properly reform the state, which was embedded with capitalist thinking, was embedded with free market thinking. So much of their approach...
There is zealotry, I guess you're saying, whichever side.
Exactly. So much of their ideological approach, the way they view the world, is very akin to that Benism, or how Tony Benn would have seen it, except for the other side of the equation. In this case, they're approaching it from the right, not the left. Mark Littlewood, indeed, in his own speech, as I say, the former director of the IAA, who's spearheading this project, went on to quote Benn directly, not long after I'd had that thought. The other thing it kind of reminds me a bit of, and you just said there about the fact they're still in government, it kind of reminds me a little bit, certainly in terms of the arguments and what they're trying to do, of a kind of proto-Tea Party, of a attempt, very similar sort of dynamics when the Republicans are ejected from office in 2008-9 and they're searching around for an explanation. Two differences with that, of course, is one, they're still in office, as you say, and the other difference being this is actually, ironically enough again, a project of elites. This isn't a grassroots thing that's going on across the country. Arguably, if that does exist, you could argue that's more in the sort of Reform Party direction. This is something basically comprised of Conservative parliamentary elites at the top of the party. So right now, they've got the tunes and they've got a sort of diagnosis, as flawed as I think it is, and it might be, about what's gone wrong with the country. But they don't have an army. They don't have a kind of big disaffected group of Conservative voter or Conservative members out there, partly because the Conservative Party is so small, to actually command and lead. So far, all they've got is an idea.
Yeah, there was an amazing picture on Twitter of a hugely long queue of people, not waiting to go to PopCon, but actually trying to find an NHS dentist in Bristol.
Well, indeed. About which they don't have much to say. And of course, I already said, one of the people who was there was Nigel Farage, the sort of Pied Piper of conservative politics or right-wing politics. And actually, he is quite clear that he's not rejoining the Conservative Party anytime soon, and actually was quite disparaging about even this whole event. Only Nigel Farage could have the sheer chutzpah of turning up to an event like that where he's still being heralded and still nonetheless basically attack everybody who was in it. I caught up with him at the event. This is a part of what he had to say.
How does it feel to be once again at the centre of Conservative politics? They're all running away from you again, aren't they?
Oh, this is not Conservative politics. This is 10 members of Parliament, roughly, with an agenda that, yeah, I mean, actually...
Would you like this? Would you like
would
all this?
But just say vote reform. These people are isolated. Liz Truss, Jacob Rees-Mogg are a tiny minority within the parliamentary party. The gap between the parliamentary Conservative Party and Conservative voters, I've never seen it wider in my lifetime.
So that's Farage. We know obviously Liz Truss was there. Did try and catch up with her for us, Emily.
That didn't go quite so smoothly, did it?
It didn't go quite so smoothly. I mean, she's not perhaps our biggest fans.
Right.
But let's just play you the exchange insofar as you can call it an exchange we did have. And I'm trying to, you can't see this obviously, but we are trying to catch her as she is being escorted out of the room with her minders all around her, big sort of throng around her, because believe it or not, in this very small section of the population, she remains something of a rock star.
Liz Truss, what makes you think you're the best person to represent a popular conservatism, Liz Truss?
Thank you very much. Oh, all right.
Liz Truss, why do you attack the BBC so much? Is that really befitting a former Prime Minister attacking the BBC as much as you do?
And then she was escorted out at that point, and unfortunately we didn't get our exclusive interview with the former Prime Minister, but of course we're still hoping. And Liz, if you
the chair is waiting.
The John Sopel Memorial Chair is waiting for you. Someone who did give us a bit more time is the former Business Secretary Jacob Rees-Mogg, and he in his speech talked about many of the themes that Truss talked about in hers, and in particular had this phrase. He started to talk about the age or the era of Davos man being over. Davos, of course, being the sort of annual meeting of international business people, politicians, financiers, and so on. And I found this very odd, and I think it speaks to something that is always, for me, one of the great contradictions of this whole movement, but Rees-Mogg in particular, which is, of course, what Rees-Mogg means by that is he is anti-elite. The age of kind of political and economic elites are over, or is over. And, of course, Jacob Rees-Mogg, in so many ways, embodies elitism, for good or ill. And in particular, of course, he made his fortune, inherited some from his father, but he made his fortune, a considerable fortune, from the city and international deals and trade and all of those sorts of things. So I wanted to ask him about that potential tension. And this is what he said.
You railed against Davos man. How much money did you make in the city? That rather is relevant.
That's such a childish question. I've never had anything to do with Davos, and I know that you've become a very left-wing broadcaster, but asking me lefty questions doesn't really get us anywhere.
It's not a matter of left or right. It's a matter of probing your position, Mr.
I never had
Rees-Mogg.
anything to do with Davos.
But Davos, I would imagine what you're suggesting by talking about Davos is a sense of a man...
internationalism.
Yes.
I'm in favour of the nation state, which was clear from my speech, if you'd listened.
I listened to every word you said, but it still seemed to me, I listened extremely carefully, but it's possible and entirely appropriate that we try and probe some of the intellectual positions. Good. I mean, it's not one of the problems...
You seem to be representing the left wing. Are you doing your bit of due impartiality that Ofcom requires you? Or are you here as a left-wing broadcaster?
Mr. Rees-Mogg, I know
I'm
that you're
very
rather...
interested in this, because this comes up with GB News, which I broadcast
Which, of course, is completely impartial. Mr. Rees-Mogg...
It meets the requirements of due impartiality, and
well,
I'm
not according to Ofcom. Mr. Rees-Mogg, I know that you want to go on the attack rather than talking about the issues.
Do you meet the requirements of due
impartiality? If you would allow to, absolutely. And unlike GB News, of course, which is repeatedly...
A strong left-wing
Mr. Rees-Mogg, I'm not putting a strong left-wing view of anything. I'm simply trying to ask you and interrogate you about some... No, not at all. Well, according to your own summary, one more question. Is not one of the problems... Well, I would do if you allow me to ask a question.
Again. Please get the point.
Honestly. Is not one of the problems that conservatives such as yourself have started to go down a track where you're not willing to accept trade-offs? Yes, we could pull out of all of these institutions and organisations, but ultimately there will be costs in so doing, just as there was with Brexit. And sometimes you start to talk about a world as you would like it to be rather than the world as it is, which is exactly the sort of thing that conservatives used to be very good at addressing.
No, the Conservative Party has always been a practical party, and there are always trade-offs with doing one thing or another. But parties have to talk about ideas, otherwise they get nowhere. You seem to wish to live in an ideas-free zone. It's quite extraordinary.
Ideas-free zone? Not
That's
at all.
what you
I'm
seem to be
trying
arguing for.
interrogate
Anyway, you
your
said that was
position.
last question.
Indeed.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Rees-Mogg. Thank you.
Anyway, that was our exchange, which was a bit odd. I've interviewed him many, many times, and he always, he might have the odd little quip or something, but as you know, Emily, he usually does it rather politely. He seemed to be rather irritated about something there. But the reason I asked it, and the reason I think it matters, is because the thing with this movement, and again, this is another way it reminds me of kind of Bennism or even Corbynism, is that actually they are very, very good at talking to themselves. They are very, very good at talking to interviewers and broadcast stations that they like. I mean, most of them have got a slot on GB News, for example, and they constantly cite Margaret Thatcher and talk about Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher was an incredible political teacher, whether you agreed with her or disagreed with her. She loved an argument and she loved going out to make her case with people she disagreed with or disagreed with her. These people, Truss will never do that. They like talking to the converted. They like proselytising to people who already agree with them. So one of their main problems in terms of launching a popular conservatism, at some point, they're going to have to get out there and not just wage a war and talk with the converts. They're going to actually have to try and convert some people. And by going on the attack, particularly with media institutions that they don't like or that they suspect, it's not going to get them anywhere.
Yeah, I would add one thing, and I guess it goes back to your Davos man conversation, which is do not make the mistake of thinking that this is a kind of a Britannia idea. This is not a standalone idea. This is almost entirely wholesale imported from the US. And if you go to, for example, the Heritage Foundation, a place that Liz Truss spoke at last year, it's a conservative think tank. It was basically the sort of Reaganite think tank, which has morphed into a very different place now, where they are talking about Project 25. And I'm going to just briefly introduce you to that, because this is a transitional blueprint for a new Donald Trump presidency, which involves dismantling federal agencies, dismantling the civil service, the sort of security services, even taking the Department of Justice under the wing of the executive, giving the executive more power. And when you actually compare what they are talking about in the US as sort of ahead of a second Trump run, and the kind of language that is more gently being shared here, again, dismantling the international organisations, talking about the courts, talking about the rule of law, talking about the unelected bureaucrats of the civil service. This all comes from the same place, which essentially involves giving the executive more power, repoliticising bodies that up till now have been, in most people's minds, neutral bodies, and they will call left-wing quangos. This is an international movement. Liz Truss will be talking to the new president of Argentina, probably, if she can get hold of him. She will be talking to the Bannons of this world, to the Heritage Foundation, to CPAC. She's going to CPAC, the Conservative Parties Association Conference in Washington. This is all part of one movement. It is not just something happening in a little cellar somewhere far away.
In a way, I think the simplest way to think about the fissures at the heart of the Conservative Party at the moment, which will dominate also after the election, where presumably they're in opposition, which is largely what this is about, is that more and more, with every week that goes by, you can see that there is a difference between being a Conservative with a small c and being a Conservative with a big C. And the big C, which all of these people are all part of that international project you were just talking about, Emily, which is an Anglo-American one, particularly an American one, which has been a radicalising project, arguably over many decades, since the 1980s and the Conservative Revolution then, but this keeps becoming more and more radical and is starting to now eat up and consume even the institutions that small c Conservatives would typically have wanted to protect. And these people are now, the big C Conservatives, are actually putting the attack of these institutions, the reform, even indeed abandonment of these institutions, at the heart of their politics. That's the big change.
We'll be back after the break with Charles Walker. Well, joining us now is Charles Walker, Conservative MP, somebody who's been very outspoken about Liz Truss in the past, Charles. And I guess you're in a sort of a privileged position in a way. You said you're not standing at the next election. You've got nothing to lose. You can sort of say it as you see it now. So I guess my question is, how do you see it? What is PopCon to you?
I think it's a distraction, isn't it? I mean, it's perfectly reasonable for people wanting to get together and talk about promoting new ideas and policies, but I think the way it's been framed is unhelpful to the Conservative Party. I mean, it won't have escaped your collective attention that we're behind in the opinion polls. We've got a Prime Minister who's working tirelessly to claw back that gap against the Labour Party. And I just think because you're here talking about PopCon, then it means it's a distraction.
I mean, she would argue, she has argued, that this is about the exchange of, commas here, intellectual ideas. You know, it's a good place to try and encourage people to re-find their conservative way of thinking. You wouldn't object to that.
No, I don't. But when Thatcherism was birthed, it was birthed in basement flats in the 1960s and 70s by people meeting in secret and climbing over fences to escape, so they didn't attract attention. And I think that was the serious side of politics. I mean, I know people climbing over fences doesn't feel very serious, but it was done away from the glare of the media. Of course, it was a different age, but the promoters of Thatcherism weren't necessarily the people who became the face of Thatcherism, if that makes sense. They were the thinkers within the Conservative Party who thought, right, we need to do a new way of doing things, but they themselves didn't become the story.
Well, maybe it's the Tufton Street think tankers then, I mean, that you're talking about. Who are in the room now?
Yeah, it could well be. Look, I know the world has changed, but this isn't being reported, is it, by media outlets and yourselves as some great plus for the Conservative Party. It's being reported as another minus, another question mark over the current government, over the performance of the Prime Minister, who, as I've said, I think is working every hour God sends. His work ethic is extraordinary, to try and make the right decisions in the national interest. If there were simple solutions to complex questions, we really would have found them by now.
Why is she doing it then?
Well, that's a question you need to ask Liz Truss. I mean, it reminds me, there was a BBC interview many years ago during some royal event, maybe a wedding or something, a royal wedding, and the journalist said, what does it take to be a successful monarch? Let's go and ask deposed Crown King Constance of Greece. And it is a bit, you know,
I've just got that.
Yeah.
You mean the last person in the world
so
to
what does
tell
it
you how to
take
run
to
the
be a
country?
success?
I didn't expect
I mean, sorry,
Constance to come up today,
I mean, maybe I've got the story wrong, but it's this
You're saying
is
don't go to Liz Truss to solve the
but
woes
this is not. I mean, Liz Truss had many successes as a Secretary of State, but she did not have a success as Prime Minister. I mean, I understand. I think I'm right in thinking, and I could have this wrong, that her former Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng may have announced today that he's leaving Parliament. I mean, it does seem to be, whether the lesson is right or wrong, the wrong teacher giving that lesson.
Do you believe her, Charles, when she said at the event today that this isn't about the leadership of the Conservative Party? This is about the ideas. Do you believe her when she and her colleagues say that?
But you can say that till you're blue in the face. But given the ructions of Simon Clarke, last week, and some of the behaviour of colleagues in recent weeks, of course it's going to be interpreted by the media, and most people get their news through the lens of media reporting, that it is unhelpful, if not a challenge, unhelpful to the current government and the Prime Minister, and that caused me some sadness, because there's many people at that conference who I like, who I spend time with, and it just seems a little, if I could say, self-indulgent. I want them to do all the thinking, but does it have to be done in such a public forum?
But would you agree then that, to sort of use the famous Clement Attlee phrase that he said about Harold Lasky, that a period of silence from these people might be most welcome?
You're far better educated than I am,
No.
but you are. But that would that's quite good, isn't it? That's some strong advice there. That stood the test of history. That bit of
from
advice.
a Labour Prime Minister.
I mean, it's look again. I don't see, by talking about this, I don't want to ignite. Not that I could. Tory civil war, because, as I say, there's lots of people at that conference who I've got a lot of time for. I just think they're getting this wrong.
Do you agree with their, if not what they're doing, do you agree with their fundamental thesis? I mean, speaker after speaker at PopCon today, basically what they were saying is that although the Conservative Party has made progress in some areas in its long period of government, it is unable to advance the country in a fundamentally conservative direction because there are all of these institutions, both foreign and domestic, holding them back, whether it's the CHR or whether it's the WHO or whether it's the Supreme Court. and that these things need to be looked at and potentially dismantled and reimagined so you can do conservative things.
So what, we dismantled the markets? I mean, that was the most extraordinary thing, wasn't it? When the Liz Truss budget was announced, the markets reacted very badly to it. Are they part of the conspiracy? Do we now dismantle the markets? I mean, the world is as it is. Of course, you can try and shape the world. I understand that. But a public pronouncement of what you want to do isn't doing it. So I want to make, if I'm allowed to, I met this amazing guy called Nicky Gumbel a couple of weeks ago, who is a Church of England vicar who looks at the Church of England and sees the problem. The problem is that you have parishes without vicars, and is recruiting people in. He's got a target of 6,000 to work in those parishes to bring the Christian message to the flock. And he's not doing that in the glare of publicity. He's doing that just through sheer hard work behind the scenes. And there's a lesson for some of my colleagues to learn from that. A lot of this requires hard work, not pronouncements in front of television cameras, on a lectern, on a stage. Hard work. We seem to have abandoned, some sections of my party seem to have abandoned that work ethic. And it takes me back to the Prime Minister. Reducing immigration, reducing inflation, helping people find that their mortgages are more affordable takes time. It takes time.
What does Rishi Sunak think about all this? Do you know?
I wouldn't ask him, but I tell you what, Emily. Last week we had a dinner just around the corner from here, and I was with about 170, 80 colleagues and people from central office, and I absolutely loved it. It was a really nice thing, and it reminded me that actually I do like most of my colleagues, and actually most of them are working really, really hard. And they're trying to be supportive and want to be supportive of the Prime Minister because they think they see his commitment to doing the right thing for the country. And we, after all, are a patriotic party.
Were the people who were in the room today there? Was Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng and Jacob Rees-Mogg at the dinner?
I'm not sure that they were. I can't remember because there were quite a lot of people, but I would err on the side of saying probably not, but if I'm mistaken on that, I would be happily corrected.
Jacob Rees-Mogg has said that he would like to see Nigel Farage, who was also at PopCon today, rejoin the party because he basically agrees with him on most things. Could you imagine a world where Nigel Farage joins rejoining the Conservative Party? Yes, after many, many, many years.
Look, I know Nigel Farage. I once actually had a back-to-back phone call, 2 separate phone calls with Dominic Grieve and Nigel Farage. It was a sort of right and left, to use shooting parlance. It was extraordinary. Nigel Farage actually is an interesting person, but he's not a Conservative, and he freely admits he's not a Conservative.
So what's he doing?
He's tweaking the tail. I mean, the people in that room are very, very smart, but
really?
they're not as smart as they think. And I think Nigel Farage inside will be chuckling because I don't think he has a huge amount of respect for the Conservative Party. I'm not sure he has a huge amount of time for PopCon. I don't want to use the phrase useful idiots, but you do begin to wonder, don't you, if he's there smiling? Well, he's up to something, isn't he?
What, that the people arranging it are useful idiots for him?
Yeah.
And his purposes.
You know, I don't want to, because these are my friends, but Nigel Farage has his own agenda. He's a very skilled politician. I suspect he's a lot more skilled than most of the people in that room.
Charles Walker, thank you. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Charles.
Well, we thought long and hard about whether to address the sort of big news of the day, the King's very honest, pretty transparent statement about his cancer diagnosis. And we decided that actually 24 hours on, you'd probably already know all that we can at this point possibly know about that, because it is, I guess, first and foremost, a deeply personal thing. And even if you're the King, there is a limit to kind of, I guess, how much transparency you want to show about something that you're going through for the first time and will be a shock to you and family members and all the rest of it. So we kind of stepped back. But there is one place where they are scrabbling to find the true significance of this diagnosis, and that is in the dear Commonwealth. And our Commonwealth reporter, John Sopel, reports from there.
This is John Sopel reporting from Australia for the newsagents. Good day. Obviously, the news about King Charles is huge here. He is the head of state, the leader of the Commonwealth, etc. I was listening to something on Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the ABC, an 8-minute long interview with a constitutional lawyer. And first question from the presenter was, well, what does this mean for Australia? To which the constitutional lawyer replies, not very much, really. Life will go on. And the fact of the matter is that although the King appoints the Governor-General and governors around the country, there's not much else. It's ceremonial. It's honours. And if there's a state visit, the King is here in Australia. But beyond that, it doesn't matter that much. And this interview went on, desperately trying to mine something that was of interest, a nugget that would show the constitutional importance of the King to Australia. And frankly, they were floundering a bit. And it kind of just made you reflect on, well, what is the actual constitutional significance of this moment in Australia, anywhere else in the Commonwealth, arguably in Britain as well? Because life will go on, and a job that is very much ceremonial won't get done, but the running of government will. Anyway, farewell, speak soon, bye.
But that is some way down the track.
Yeah, for now, honestly, we wish the King well from the newsagents.
Although we do have to have a little word with our cub reporter, because he has rather buried the lead a little bit there, sending that package.
Yeah, you might also want to hear from our little cub reporter down under, who's on the newsagents USA.
He's much better over there.
Yeah, much over there, under there.
Under there, wherever it is.
We also talked to John Bolton, a real American Conservative with an impressive moustache, and you can hear that whole interview on Newsagents USA later today.
Let's hope John comes back with an impressive moustache.
We'd love that,
That would
wouldn't
be
we?
lovely.
Yeah.
John, you've got your challenge.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.